Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Here we are, day 2, KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon in San Diego, and our discussions today are going to be quite a bit with Dell Technologies. And I'm lucky to have with me for our first discussion of the day, Bob Ganley, Senior Marketing Consultant with Dell EMC, and Craig Steele. Craig is GM, Pivotal Synergy Sales, Partner Sales, Global Strategic Alliances, and ISV at Pivotal. That's a mouthful. Wow, you do a lot. We're in the topic today really is IT admin to Kubernetes admin. And one of the things that I really recall from the spring conference was a discussion with the different representatives of the different sales groups throughout the world. And it was a really insightful discussion because one of the things that we talked about was, adoption of Kubernetes. And, you'll have like the C-level audience who really are like, yeah, DevOps all the way. I love this idea. And then you'll have the people who are like the technologists on the ground floor, so like, yeah, let's experiment. Let's really make this work. Let's find, let's find all these kind of cool use cases. So it's like a laboratory. And somewhere in the middle is where the reality is, right? Where like you have the business groups, you have the business units. And our discussion is about from IT admin to Kubernetes admin, and a lot of the discussion is about application lifecycle management. And how do you think about the application lifecycle management? And I think that then gets really into the actual kind of workings of an operation, the workings of an organization. So I'm just curious on, just to start, we're going to talk a lot about Dell Technologies Cloud, PKS on VCF and VxRail. We're going to talk about Project Pacific and Tanzu Mission Control. But I'd love to set the context here, and get your perspectives on that. Where are we now in that journey? Because day 1 is one thing, but day 2 is entirely another.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, the thing that we see as we talk to customers is, like you said, applications are evolving, right? So application architectures have gone from where, you ran an app on a box, it was physical. And then, of course, virtualization comes along and organizations start to cram more applications on a given box. And now trying to look for additional efficiencies, infrastructure as a service comes along with automation and orchestration and better pooling of resources and so on. And now you see this emergence of cloud native and next generation applications, and the huge crowds here and the overwhelming interest in what's going on with Kubernetes is so evident that that's where things are going. And the challenge is that organizations have to run all this stuff, and what we see is that existing traditional virtualized applications have lots of infrastructure associated with them. People know how to run them, and there's big investments in skills. And now as organizations are looking at cloud native, how do they take some of that existing investment and extend that into running this next generation set of applications? And that's the big challenge that we're seeing organizations facing today.
So how are things changing? How are you seeing that?
Yeah, it's interesting the way you framed it up front, where there are different layers, right? So you've got the C-suite, the line of business, the IT operations folks, the implementers, and there's this inconsistent way of gathering information on what to do next. And I think it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for an organization. If you look at the combined entities within the Dell Technologies family, we've from the Pivotal perspective, have been very, very supremely focused on the application development sort of tribes out there, if you will. And associated with that, depending upon what type of application it is, if it's a greenfield application, they're trying to build something that will create new revenue, a new business model, something really genuinely new. Normally, there's a line of business associated with that, and there's a revenue responsibility component to that, and just making sure that you have commitment to get what you need, not just from a people perspective, but the cultural shifts that are required to make these changes throughout the organization, and then buy-in from the executive leadership team if this is a business initiative. So, and then if you take it into the infrastructure IT operations folks, what I'm seeing, especially with the rise of Kubernetes, I think we can all agree that kind of Kubernetes has won the war. It's over now. It's just a matter of how quickly people adopt it. I think part of that, the beauty and the elegance of it in the future, in my view, will be as Kubernetes becomes just this substrate orchestration layer, right? And that everyone and every entity can and will write APIs into in some way, shape, or form. So if you're an IT administrator, and Bob and I were talking about this over breakfast this morning, there was a time where I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there were books out, and developers are the new kingmakers. And not only were they, I mean, very compelling, right, and absolutely true. At the same time, that was creating, in our view, a disconnect between, understanding applications for application's sake and where those apps and workloads should run and why, based on common sense metrics like SLAs and all that kind of stuff. And what IT operations folks were finding over time is that these developers, these kingmakers, were going around them directly to public cloud at scale providers, et cetera. And so the opportunity to, I think, learn more about how to provide infrastructure for a service to that development community was lost. And I think we can take some of the blame for not bringing our infrastructure friends, both vSphere administrators and infrastructure operations folks, and just folks that do the deployment of all this tech. We didn't bring them along fast enough. But I think that tech, getting where it is today with combined technologies, and you'll talk about the Dell Tech Cloud Platform, but a big part of that, and what I consider is the Kubernetes layer is actually part of the infrastructure. So if you're a vSphere administrator, and you mentioned Project Pacific, that would be a combination of vSphere. And if you think about that, let me retrace a bit. If you think about, this is the first time vSphere has been re-architected in over 14 years. And it's being done so that they can incorporate this Kubernetes technology as part of that go-to-market structure for customers to use as an operating model. And that is a huge, huge step for a wildly successful product called vSphere and ESXi. But it just goes to show that the world is changing, and these cloud-native apps are real, and customers want real portability for these applications, whether they be in containers or name your abstraction layer. But I think, it's a good time to help our IT administration folks and vSphere administration folks understand that now they not only have a seat at the table in terms of strategy for where these workloads should go and run and how they should run, but also be part of the conversation around abstraction layer and what technology should be used for that. So pretty interesting time to be in the ecosystem.
It sure is.
Yeah, I'd say so, especially if you consider how much the market is still changing, with conversations we're having at the show here really reflect that in many ways in terms of just the new dependencies that we all have, right, on applications that might be pulling from multiple different APIs. That brings in issues that relate to just attack surfaces, and it relates to issues that relate reflect on tooling, and and so just adopting Kubernetes is one thing, but then administrating is entirely another. And so I'm curious on what are some of those aspects of developing and delivering cloud-native applications that you see your customers getting started with, or even yourselves getting started with. What are those? what are those paths that are starting to emerge where you start, is it by work group? We often see that. It's like, like there's a workload that needs to be thought of in a different manner. And maybe just getting an understanding of the combined effect of that and how you're seeing that kind of evolve, with yourself and with customers.
Yeah, I think Craig brought it up earlier, but this whole idea that organizations ran into a situation where you had developers going out and grabbing some virtual machines or grabbing some containers in a public cloud and developing their applications there meant that they ended up kind of getting some gravity to those applications, adopting the specific infrastructure of whatever cloud provider it is that they ended up on, right? And what we really see customers looking for is that cloud isn't a place, it's an operating model, right? And so what that means is that you want to have pooled resources, you want to have ubiquitous network access, you want to have the ability to have visibility into who's using what and how much. And it's not so much about, hey, let me put my app in Amazon, right? Or let me put my app in Azure. So we're all about this concept of right workload, right cloud. Meaning, we say there's kind of, three main things that you look at. It's like, the laws of physics, the laws of economics, and the laws of the land. So, laws of physics say, maybe you need the low latency performance for a particular application, and that's going to drive, some locality. Or maybe from an economics perspective, you've got a very short-lived workload and you want to have some elastic capacity, and so that means maybe it makes sense to do some public cloud bursting for that. Or laws of the land say, gosh, I need to control where that data resides, right? So every application is going to have its own mix of where that needs to land. And so now the question becomes, do you have the flexibility to be able to place workloads where they should run while taking advantage of kind of some consistent set of tools that enable you to control those wherever they sit? And that's, I think, the big opportunity here for us, and where we see organizations gaining some of the most benefit out of a multi-cloud approach is, can we have a consistent operating model? Can we have a set of tools that allow us to apply policy across multiple different clouds, right? With one way to apply that policy. Security begins with who are you and what do you have access to? And if you have multiple different ways of saying who are you and what do you have access to, then it's very difficult to say you're securing your workloads in that multi-cloud environment. So we're looking at this as an opportunity to help kind of equalize the playing field here so that organizations truly have that workload placement flexibility. And that, we think, is what's the power of the Dell Tech Cloud approach, frankly.
So with that approach then, and how the responsibilities are changing, what is Dell offering? And I'm curious, and maybe just to back up, how does Pivotal Kubernetes Service fit into this? How does it, and maybe you could help us understand better, but like, for instance, VCF and VxRail and how they fit into this overall kind of focus that you have.
Yeah, this is another topic that we were kind of discussing this morning. I think it starts with the application from Pivotal's perspective. When you look at customers' existing workloads, we are also stewards at Pivotal of a technology called Spring, which you're aware of, Spring Cloud, Spring Boot. And when I first started at Pivotal almost 5 years ago, I think it is 5 years ago this month, we were probably at about 30,000 downloads of Spring Cloud per month. And last month, we hit a mark of 85 million downloads per month. So what this means is customers are taking it upon themselves to take existing monolithic applications, rewriting them in these new frameworks so that they can become microservices type of architecture and make changes to those applications that they need to continue to deliver or pull value from. Use cases and verticals, the stories are limitless at this point. But even I was with a customer, healthcare customer in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and they have so much systems of record data that, when these systems were built, they were not built in mind with, hey, we need to give our patients access to all the information in these systems, right? So now the idea is, how do I write an application, a modern application that's microservices based, that has different features and functionality, that has the ability to also pull data from those existing systems and leverage those for value for patient care. And so it's use cases like that that kind of change the thinking around what an app was, what an app can be, and what an app should be, right? And the should be is when you're starting from scratch, in our view. Right. So that's really, from our approach, it's been, okay, Cloud Foundry is a great way, has a great tool chain. You brought this up earlier. Our philosophy has been continuous integration, continuous delivery via pipelines that you build for your applications. So your applications end up being more of a product than anything else, and you continuously work on that product to make it better, faster, stronger, and scalable. We do use different tools, Concourse, other tool sets within that ecosystem to make that happen, but that's how we approach it from an application lifecycle management perspective. And then from a platform perspective, managing, patching, upgrading the infrastructure beneath that with other technology like Bosch has been super helpful for customers to do that at scale. And then now when you consider even like the next frontier of applications, so you're starting to see, all the ISVs are now packaging their software in containers for delivery to customers, if not all now, all in the future. You have applications that are, purpose-built for specific activity within different verticals. Even, financials come to mind. In the industries where you have B2B type of activity, where if you look at an end user customer, like I'll think of an example because I saw a receipt for this morning that shocked me. My wife was at Airbnb and crushed it. But if you look at a customer like Airbnb, who does their logistics, who does their point of sale, who does their inventory management and control. These are all different aspects of an application that can be built in a common way for leverage, scale, and revenue for an organization. Right. So there is so much thinking that goes into this from an application perspective. And now, when you take it to a containers layer, historically, Pivotal had this sort of, I'm sure you've talked to and met with James Waters. Yeah. Most people have. And he's kind of, in my view, the person that has this constant thought leadership candle next to him. He's always a little bit ahead of everyone else. It's pretty cool to see. But his approach, or the way he described it, has always been sort of right ahead of what's next, and kind of where his talk track is now. I was in Spain for VMworld and watched one of the presentations he and Craig McCluskey gave, and there are all these enterprise patterns that are starting to develop that we can take advantage of. And really help customers get to this place of being able to, again, via a pipeline and treating software code as a product, being able to create it, scale it, upgrade it, patch it, management, repave it, rotate it, replace it, all of these things in a pipeline systematic way. That's now all starting to happen from a Kubernetes substrate perspective as well. Right. So I think that's kind of the two layers, and then I think in the not too distant future, you will see a convergence of those capabilities within a common substrate, and folks will look at that as like the Kubernetes substrate. But then it gets into, okay, VMware's got an interesting and really, so far in its infancy, pretty successful story in managing cloud workloads, both on-premises vSphere environments, and also via, I think the product's called VCM. There's EMC, I'll learn more about this as the weeks unfold, I'm sure here. But VCM and VCF are two products that can be used to lifecycle manage not just the infrastructure, but actually move workloads from an on-premises environment to the cloud of your choice. It's also within, and something you mentioned earlier, the purview of what will be mission control. Right, so this whole Tanzu build, run, manage set of solutions that VMware with Pivotal and Bitnami and a couple of other acquisitions by VMware will bring together it's like if we all had $1 for every time we heard the phrase, "We're going to manage everything on a single pane of glass." Like, this is the first time where I actually literally believe it. Like, I've seen enough of the demos and sort of, pre-GA use cases and seen this stuff work in real time that this is going to help accelerate where customers are in terms of building applications, managing those applications, and importantly, moving those applications in a multi-cloud world.
So when you're thinking about this, and it's obviously that the IT admin is extending their skills, and they're extending it, by what I think of it as, and how you describe Pivotal's journey is what we do see, for instance, with the larger scale providers as well, is these commonalities, developing just common standard approaches and workflows that the team can manage, and then use technologies accordingly that make sense for them, right?
Yes.
So it's those teams that really are, define the workloads, those individual roles on those teams, and then that provides them the framework for, for like setting up those common approaches, be it through the API or just through policy, you name it. And so, Dell has these purpose-built appliances, right? And I'm curious how these architectures provide that production-ready platform.
Yep.
For Kubernetes that can support, VMware virtualized applications, for example. And in the meantime, we're providing that those capabilities for people who are still who are learning how to manage new Kubernetes architectures in themselves. So how do those appliances help kind of facilitate the process?
Yeah, I think to go back to what Craig was saying, this is all about this idea of how do you support next generation applications from an infrastructure perspective, right? And as we talked about, Kubernetes is one of those common tools that organizations are going to be using is Kubernetes. And so as you're looking at having the ability to roll out next generation applications, you have to have Kubernetes dial tone. And one of the things you want to do is make sure that's based on upstream Kubernetes without any forks, without any proprietary extensions, so that if you're developing an application and you're deciding to run that application in this public cloud Kubernetes service, you can have that same application run on a private cloud Kubernetes service should you choose, because you're using that upstream standard-based Kubernetes distribution. And that's really what PKS is all about, is let's have a repeatable model for being able to deploy standard upstream Kubernetes on on-premises infrastructure. And so, part of the Dell Tech Cloud solution is this idea of PKS, which is essentially Pivotal work with VMware to produce this enterprise PKS package, which is standard upstream Kubernetes that runs on VMware Cloud Foundation.
Right.
And that, in turn, we package all that up on a VxRail appliance, right? So the whole idea is to have a hyper-converged infrastructure base that allows you to scale out clusters as you see fit. And of course, you've got a layer of virtualization environment on top of that, and VCF is what that is. Now, we've very tightly integrated VCF with VxRail in a way that allows VMware administrators and people that know how to live in front of vCenter for a living to actually be able to manage that entire stack without ever having to leave their common, comfortable vCenter environment. So when it comes down to, a CVE is described, which requires an update to the latest version of vSphere, let's say, and that requires a new version of the firmware. That used to be an exercise which caused,
Right.
People to stay up at night and on the weekends, and maybe even do, create outages if they didn't get it right. So we've automated that entire thing to include automation for the lifecycle management for the platform. Now you add on top of that Kubernetes and the ability to have a standard distribution of Kubernetes that's integrated with the current version of VMware Cloud Foundation, which runs on this appliance, now you've got a full stack of infrastructure on premises that allows you to have that standard Kubernetes environment. And not only do you know your application can move from there to public cloud should it need to, but you also know that you can auto lifecycle manage Kubernetes. How many releases were there of Kubernetes in 2018? I thought there were like 90 releases of Kubernetes, right? So as one of those drops, and maybe it's because of a CVE, you want to be able to update your production environment on premises to make sure you've got the latest and greatest. Well, what we do is, as soon as Google has verified that works in GKE, we roll up a bill of materials that now the administrator sitting in front of that console can apply that in a way that will non-disruptively update your Kubernetes clusters to the latest and greatest software.
So now let's move into discussions about cloud native, and I'm curious on how these approaches with Kubernetes, with these purpose-built appliances, fits with something like Project Pacific and Tanzu Mission Control.
Yeah, so this is not a new concept, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we started the process when this was prior to Dell acquiring EMC and Pivotal and VMware. We were at this point where we were starting to get, Pivotal was kind of rotating from being in sort of the Hadoop Wars and Gemfire and Greenplum database market to, hey, we've got a lot of customers downloading Spring. We've got what we believe is a really industrialized, enterprise-ready grade of Cloud Foundry, and 60-70% of the time, customers are deploying this on-premises on vSphere environments. So how do we come together to simplify the process for customers who actually want to deploy this? This was 4 or 5 years ago. They just want to start on-premises. How do we make that happen faster? And in its infancy, the first quarter when we came to market with Pivotal Cloud Foundry, we started to see a trend, right? And that trend was this was a little bit of a heavy services lift to get customers started with. PCF arrives, as I described earlier, like as a box of razor blades, and only our Pivotal app whisperers knew how to deploy it, and you had to do it a certain way, and it was a little bit fragile in its infancy. But we've built some best practices, we've built some repeatability into that deployment process. And then the next phase was, how do we help customers get it up and running quicker in their data center and typically in their vSphere environments? And so what we came up with was, a stack of infrastructure that consisted of hyper-converged infrastructure, VxRail, running on vSphere with PCF on top.
Okay.
And we call that now Pivotal Ready Architecture. It's basically a reference architecture. There's probably, I would say, 30 or 40 customers, big enterprise one global type customers that are running this stack of infrastructure at scale.
Interesting.
And so, in spring, our last conference, the CIO of, I think it was TD Ameritrade, went up and talked about his company's experience with leveraging PCF. And then at the end of his presentation, he said, oh, by the way, we're running this all on Pivotal Ready Architecture, and we're about to buy our 6th rack of this. So this is being done. It's being done at scale. It's packaged. We understand how to size it and architect it for customers' use cases. It's also ready for PKS. So obviously PKS is part of that bill of materials. And I think now that Dell Tech Cloud Platform has announced GA and actually has customers now, I believe, running VCF, lifecycle managing VxRail, that just makes that Pivotal Ready Architecture stack, which is basically a reference architecture, it just makes it that much more powerful in the future. And then the other thing I would say is, post the acquisition, which is, I think, almost inevitable, Pivotal going into the VMware family holistically, I think you will see, if I have my way about it, you will see this become a VMware validated design alongside of the Dell Tech Cloud Platform that becomes ubiquitous and part of the Dell Technologies family of how to buy a stack to run not just your historical revenue generating apps in a re-architected way, but also how you run cloud native apps and how you run your apps that are containerized. And I think it's just a great solution.
Just in conclusion, I'd like to ask how Dell is getting more involved in the community to propel the efforts with cloud native technologies, both for them as a company, but also for sharing your own expertise and knowledge that has a big effect on the overall ecosystem.
So off the top of my head, when I think of Dell, I think of Dell Technologies as a whole. That includes Pivotal, VMware, Boomi. There's a bunch of companies under the umbrella. As it relates to Kubernetes, with the acquisition of Hiptio, I think it was a year ago, Joe Beta, Craig McCluskey, two of the founders, inventors, if you will, of Kubernetes itself, their teams, and then the folks that are part of Pivotal that were part of that ecosystem and jointly developing PKS with Google and VMware. I think we've moved up to number 2 on the contributors list to this fastest growing open source software ecosystem in history called Kubernetes. So we're contributing. I think that will only gain momentum. We serve at the pleasure of our customers, and when our customers want new features, functionalities, and capabilities, we go out and figure out how to do it for them, and we bring that back to them in a supportable, productized way. So I think we're up there contribution-wise, and I think that will continue to accelerate.
Great. Any last thoughts?
Well, as I said, I think we're most excited about the fact that most organizations are going through this transition from physical to virtual to infrastructure as a service to container as a service and cloud native. And the real opportunity here is to make an environment that doesn't force people to cut over to cloud native and leave behind their existing workloads or their existing skill sets.
That's right.
Which is, let's be able to run virtualized applications and containerized applications with standard Kubernetes orchestration in the same set of hardware, and let's have the same IT administrator literally be able to provision Kubernetes clusters or provision vSphere clusters as needed in a way that's very standard. So
But with Kubernetes as a substrate.
That's correct. And do that in a way that's very repeatable, and so we get out of this business of having to build a snowflake container as a service platform in order to run something on-prem.
Yeah, it's a value proposition that I think differentiates us as a combined set of entities around the Kubernetes space. Really focused on vanilla upstream Kubernetes with something like PKS Enterprise that takes care of the day 2 operational aspects that we discussed earlier, regardless of where the clusters are running, if it's on the at-scale providers, if it's on-prem, if it's multi-clustered, if it's one. It should be a consistent operating model, a consistent experience, and a consistent way to really build infrastructure as code pipelines in the Kubernetes space.
Well, thank you so much for your time to talk with us here at the New Stack about Dell and its approaches to both, the changing role of IT admins, the role of PKS, the role of these purpose-built appliances, and cloud-native technologies and their impacts on the organization with Kubernetes as that substrate. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Yeah,
Appreciate it
with you today.
Dell Technologies is a unique family of businesses that helps organizations and individuals build their digital future and transform how they work, live, and play. The company provides customers with the industry's broadest and most innovative technology and services portfolio, spanning from edge to core to cloud. Learn more at Dell.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.